At dawn on March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea looked peaceful enough to make men forget there was a war. The sky was streaked with soft light, clouds drifting in ribbons, the sea a quiet pane of silver. On the bridge of the destroyer, Shirayuki, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura leaned against the railing, binoculars steady in his hands. Ahead of him, 8 transports moved in formation, 8 lifelines carrying the 51st Infantry Division to reinforce New Guinea. Nearly 7,000 soldiers slept below decks, their rifles stacked beside them, their futures sealed by orders they couldn't understand. Kimura had made this run before. For more than a year, Japan's convoys had crossed these waters under the umbrella of destroyers and air cover from Rabaul. There had been close calls, but never a disaster. Doctrine had worked. Faith in the Imperial Navy's discipline had become routine. One officer murmured on the bridge, "The Americans are clumsy. They attack where we expect them to." Kimura said nothing, only nodded once. Confidence to him was not arrogance, it was duty. Below decks, the soldiers were young. Boys from Osaka, Kyoto, and Sapporo, their faces still soft with youth. Some were writing quick letters home, others sharing rice and jokes about how they'd soon be heroes in the jungles of New Guinea. To them, this voyage was simply the prelude to glory. None imagined the sea beneath them would soon turn into a furnace. At 0600 hours, Kimura lifted his binoculars again. The horizon burned gold, the ships lined up in perfect symmetry. Destroyers Arashio, Asashio, Yukikaze, and Shikinami flanked the convoy like loyal wolves, their wakes tracing white ribbons across the sea. Every ship maintained exact spacing, 8 cables apart, 12 knots. It was a portrait of precision, of the Navy's faith in order. Kimura thought of Admiral Yamamoto's doctrine, "Speed and discipline are armor." He believed it. He had to. War was a science of repetition. Drills, charts, bearings. The enemy might have numbers, but Japan had perfection. He turned to his navigator. "No deviation from schedule," he said. "The 51st must reach Leh intact." It was the same command he had given dozens of times, but this time, fate was already awake, hundreds of miles away. That morning, reports came through the radio. Visibility clear. No enemy aircraft sighted. The bridge relaxed. Sailors sipped tea. The ship's loudspeakers played a soft military march. To them, the Americans were predictable. High-altitude bombers dropping from miles above, missing more often than hitting. Japan's gunners had laughed at those raids, the flak bursts like fireworks, the bombs splashing harmlessly into the sea. It had become routine to survive. No one aboard Kimura's convoy knew that, far to the south, in the choking heat of an airfield near Brisbane, an American mechanic-turned-commander was tearing apart a bomber, and the future of naval warfare was taking shape in his hands. What he was developing would shatter the illusion of safety that surrounded the Japanese fleet and change the course of the war in the Pacific forever. Major Pappy Gunn wasn't the kind of man who waited for orders. He'd been a mechanic, a Navy pilot, and even a fugitive in his own chain of command. Now, he was the 5th Air Force's wild card, stationed at Eagle Farm, Australia. Gunn had seen American bombers fail time and again over the Pacific. High-altitude runs against enemy ships were completely useless. Torpedoes would jam, the expensive bomb sights would fog over, and far too many pilots were dying just trying to hit a tiny moving speck in 1,000 miles of ocean. For Pappy Gunn, the answer was brutally simple. If the bombs couldn't reliably hit the ships, then the planes themselves had to become the weapons. He rolled a B-25 Mitchell bomber into his hangar, a rugged, grease-stained man with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, and got to work. He pointed at the bomber's nose and barked at his men, "Take everything out that doesn't make it shoot." The Norden bomb sight, the bombardier's seat, the complex wiring, it was all torn out, gone. In its place, his crew began welding steel plates and installing ammunition boxes. They were building something new, something fierce, right there in that dusty hangar filled with smoke and the bright glare of welders' sparks. Gunn started with just 2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. Then he added 2 more. He wasn't satisfied. He added 4 more. By the time the clatter of tools finally fell silent, the B-25's nose bristled with 8 forward-facing guns. It was no longer a bomber. It was a metallic beast that could chew through steel armor. Each gun could fire 850 rounds a minute. Together, that meant a storm of nearly 7,000 rounds of fire every single 60 seconds. It was an airborne destroyer, purpose-built for one thing. He reinforced the plane's frame with salvaged steel, painstakingly recalculated the trim, and rerouted the fuel lines by hand. There were no manuals for this, no official permissions, just Gunn's stubborn will to win. His mechanics were skeptical, warning him that the immense recoil from all those guns could tear the plane apart in mid-air. But Gunn just smiled, a glint in his eye. "She won't bomb anymore," he told them. "She'll eat ships." As the sun set, casting a long, menacing shadow of the modified aircraft, a mechanical monster had been reborn. At dawn, it was Gunn himself who climbed into the cockpit. He wasn't wearing a standard flight suit, just his work coveralls with a wrench tucked into his belt. The twin engines roared to life, kicking up a cloud of dust that mixed with the smell of hot oil. The ground crew covered their ears as the B-25, now heavy with ammunition and defiance, rumbled down the runway. At 500 feet, Gunn leveled off over the test range. He took a breath, and then he pressed the trigger. The nose of the plane erupted in a deafening explosion of fire and thunder. 8 streams of tracer light tore through the morning haze, the recoil shaking the entire airframe like a living animal trying to break free. A storm of spent shells rained from the fuselage, bouncing off the wings in a metallic hailstorm. When he landed, the massive grin on his face said everything. In that moment, a new kind of warplane was born, the Strafer. Word of this new monstrous bomber spread like wildfire through the 5th Air Force. Pilots flocked to Eagle Farm, eager to see Pappy Gunn's creation. When he finally pulled the trigger, the sound was apocalyptic. The air itself seemed to tear open. One observer was heard muttering, "That's not a bomber, that's a buzzsaw." Another whispered, "It's a destroyer with wings." Soon the big boss himself, General George C. Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, arrived to see it for himself. He watched Gunn's demonstration, arms folded, sunglasses hiding his expression. After the test, he turned to his aide and said quietly, but with chilling conviction, "Build 100 if you can. They'll tear Japan's lifeline apart." And so they did. Within weeks, airfields across Australia were buzzing with activity. They were filled with modified B-25s, field-built, unpainted, often patched with salvaged metal. The pilots had a new name for them, Strafer Mitchells. Each one was unique, a testament to ingenuity, welded together by hand and by faith. While Gunn was turning bombers into flying shotguns, another officer was waging a different kind of war, a war against physics. Major William Benn was methodical, quiet, the kind of man who measured twice before speaking once. He had watched countless bombing runs fail over the vast Pacific. The ocean was too big, the enemy ships too fast, and the bombs too slow. So he posed a question that sounded absolutely absurd. "What if," he said, "we make the bombs skip?" He'd watched children skipping flat stones across a river. If a simple stone could do it, why not a bomb? He theorized that at a very low altitude, at just the right speed and distance, a bomb might bounce once or twice off the water's surface, then slam directly into a ship's hull at the waterline. It was a crazy idea, born from the kind of desperation that breeds true invention. At Port Moresby, Benn's crews began their strange new training. Their target was a stranded hulk, the rusted SS Pruth, half sunk on a reef. They flew their B-25s at just 200 feet, barely skimming the waves, engines screaming in protest. The first attempts were total disasters. Bombs skipped wildly, exploded too early, or terrifyingly, bounced back toward the planes that dropped them. But slowly, painfully, they figured it out. They learned the secret recipe: fly at 250 feet, maintain a speed of 220 miles per hour, and release the bomb at exactly 600 yards from the target. When they got it right, the bomb behaved perfectly. It skipped once, twice, and hit the ship's hull like a thunderous hammer. From the air, it looked like they were throwing a stone so hard the sea itself jumped out of the way. When General Kenney saw the new technique demonstrated, he was silent for a long moment, watching through his binoculars. Then a grim smile. He lowered them and said, "That's it. That's how we'll end Japan's shipping." A new, deadly chapter in the air war was about to begin. The 3rd Attack Group, soon to be nicknamed the Grim Reapers, received the very first of these new Strafer bombers. These weren't just machines, they were statements. Pilots painted menacing shark mouths and bold names across their noses. Ruthless, Hell's Angel, Little Helen. Each plane carried not just guns, but an attitude, raw, improvised, and utterly lethal. Their training was as radical as their weapons. Pilots learned to fly at treetop height, to feel the very breath of the ocean just beneath their wings. They practiced relentlessly until the water below was a blur, until the deafening roar of their engines drowned out fear itself. The doctrine they were given was simple and terrifying. Get close enough to see the whites of their eyes. Every single pilot knew what that meant. A single mistake would be fatal. But they also knew that if it worked, no ship could possibly stand against them. By late February 1943, the moment they had been waiting for arrived. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted a Japanese convoy moving south from Rabaul. It consisted of 8 transports and 8 destroyers. Its destination, Leh. To the Japanese command, this was just another routine supply run. But to the American and Australian forces, it was the ultimate test. A live-fire exam for guns welded in secret and bombs designed to skip across water like stones. Back at the airfields of Eagle Farm and Port Moresby, the air throbbed with anticipation and the noise of preparation. Mechanics swarmed over the bombers, double-checking fuses. Armorers loaded endless belts of ammunition. Inside makeshift briefing rooms, pilots huddled over maps marked with grease pencil, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and rain. Some men, too anxious to sleep in their bunks, slept right beside their planes, afraid they might miss the call at dawn. For many of them, the next sunrise would be their very last. In the final briefing, held in the dark hours before the mission, General Kenny stood before his men. He didn't need a long speech. They all knew what was at stake. "Remember," he told them, his voice calm but firm, "the sea's flat. They'll never expect us to come in that low." Pilots exchanged grim nods. Some scribbled last-minute notes, while others just stared at the floor, lost in their own thoughts. When the meeting finally ended, a few shook hands quietly. Not as a ceremony, but as a silent acknowledgement of the immense danger they were about to face. Outside, a soft rain fell on the tarmac as engines began to rumble to life, one after another, building into a powerful chorus that filled the night. By the time the first aircraft lifted off the runway, the eastern sky was just beginning to turn grey. Far to the north, unaware, Admiral Kimura's convoy was sailing straight into history and into a storm that no existing military doctrine could ever have predicted. For that moment, the Bismarck Sea remained calm. Japanese sailors laughed and shared stories. Young soldiers below deck wrote letters home, and Admiral Kimura put his faith in the time-tested mathematics of his naval escort line. But somewhere in the darkness, a radical idea was about to replace tradition. In a few dusty hangars, men without blueprints had built weapons that would rewrite the very laws of war. Within 24 hours, the ocean would burn, and the world would witness how 15 minutes of brutal, terrifying combat could change not just the course of a war, but the very idea of warfare itself. At 10:00 a.m. on March 3, 1943, a routine day at sea was about to turn into a nightmare. Aboard the Japanese destroyer Shirayuki, lookouts spotted silver glints on the northern horizon. At first, they were just tiny specks, dots rising out of the haze. But then there were more. Men shaded their eyes against the sun and a cry went up. "American bombers!" Admiral Masatomi Kimura lowered his binoculars, a familiar sight coming into focus. B-17 flying fortresses. These lumbering giants were known for their high-altitude runs, and he had faced them before. They were slow, clumsy, and their bombing was often wasteful. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Maintain course," he ordered, standard anti-aircraft pattern. Around the convoy, the escorting destroyers turned their guns skyward. Flak bursts began to pepper the clouds, black puffs spreading like ink in the blue sky. On the decks, the officers felt a grim satisfaction. This was routine, this was predictable, but they were wrong. They didn't know that death was already skimming the waves below the horizon, unseen, unheard, and absolutely unstoppable. 15 miles south of the high-flying B-17s, The true strike force was racing in. This was a completely different kind of attack. 12 B-25 Mitchells of the 3rd Attack Group and 13 Australian Beaufighters were flying barely 50 feet above the sea. The waves licked their belly armor, and their propellers kicked up a mist of white spray as they charged forward like cavalry across the water. Each aircraft was a flying arsenal, armed with 8 machine guns in the nose, and behind those guns, they carried 2 500-pound bombs fitted with special delayed action fuses, a crucial part of the deadly new plan. In the cockpit of his B-25, nicknamed Ruthless, Major Edward Ed Liner adjusted his goggles. Through the windshield, he saw the black smoke of the Japanese flak far ahead and high above, exactly where he wanted it. "They're looking up," he muttered to himself. "Good." With a firm hand, he pushed the throttle forward. The engines howled in protest, and the horizon grew wide and violent. At exactly 10:12 a.m., the B-25s burst over the wave tops and smashed straight into the unsuspecting convoy. The Japanese lookouts saw them far too late. "Enemy low, very low," came the desperate call from the Shirayuki's deck, but the warning was instantly drowned out by the deafening roar of machine guns. In his cockpit, Major Liner pressed the trigger. 8 barrels flared to life. A storm of tracer fire slashed the air, a continuous wall of light that tore through steel and flesh with horrifying efficiency. The bridge of the Shirayuki erupted in a shower of sparks. Men were flung backward, their bodies twisting in the smoke, as metal plates folded inward and windows shattered into a million pieces. For 8 full seconds, Liner held the trigger down, pouring nearly 900 rounds into the ship's superstructure before he finally released the bombs. They didn't fall from the sky, they skipped across the water like stones. 1 bounce, 2 bounces, and then they struck the Shirayuki right below the waterline. The explosion blew the destroyer's midsection wide open. Flames burst from every hatch, and the ship, once pristine, began to list heavily, its white hull now a blazing furnace. The attack wasn't just on one ship, it was a symphony of destruction. Following Liner's lead, the other B-25s fanned out, each picking a target. The Japanese sailors trained for high-altitude threats were caught completely off guard. Their anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress low enough, fast enough. The sky was filled with the sound of roaring engines and the relentless chatter of 50-caliber machine guns. On the transport ships, soldiers who had been relaxing on deck moments before were now scrambling for cover that didn't exist. Bullets ripped across the decks, turning wood to splinters and steel to shrapnel. One by one, the bombers released their skipping bombs. Explosions rocked the convoy, sending columns of fire and black smoke billowing into the sky. The sea itself seemed to boil as ships broke apart, their hulls torn open, their cargo of men and supplies destined for the ocean floor. This revolutionary tactic, known as skip bombing, had been developed and perfected in secret. It turned bombers into ship killers of terrifying efficiency. By coming in low and fast, they avoided radar and anti-aircraft fire. By strafing the decks, they suppressed any return fire and created chaos. And by using delayed fuse bombs that skipped across the water, they ensured their weapons struck the most vulnerable part of a ship, its hull right at the waterline. For Admiral Kimura and the Japanese convoy, it was a brutal lesson. The sky they had been watching was a decoy. The real threat had come from the sea itself. In a matter of minutes, the 3rd Attack Group had changed the face of naval warfare forever, turning the Bismarck Sea into a graveyard of ships. What started as a routine escort mission had become a defining moment of the Pacific War. Behind Ruthless, 11 more B-25s stormed in. Each chose its target, and each found it. Lieutenant John Henterbury, flying the Hare, aimed for the transport Kikusai Maru. He walked his fire from bow to stern, silencing every anti-aircraft gun. His bombs struck seconds later, a twin eruption of flame and smoke. The Kikusai Maru split amidships. Above them, the Australian Beaufighters dove in from the sun, strafing decks with cannon fire. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy remembered, "You could see the men on deck firing back. Then our cannons hit, and they were gone." The sea boiled. Transports turned hard to port. Destroyers zigzagged wildly. But the attackers came too low, too fast, too precise. It wasn't a battle. It was a dissection. The destroyer Arashio tried to shield the transports, placing itself between the bombers and the convoy. It was an act of courage and suicide. 3 B-25s converged on her from different angles, guns blazing. The bridge vanished in fire. Helm destroyed, Arashio veered uncontrollably and rammed the transport Nojima Maru. Both ships locked together, burning fiercely. Ammunition cooked off in rapid bursts, echoing like thunder. From the air, the scene looked impossible. Ships colliding in flame, men leaping into water already burning. Major Liner's tail gunner looked down and whispered, "It was hell, but alive." In just 15 minutes, the sea was on fire. Everywhere, black smoke, orange flame, and drifting wreckage. The Taime Maru sank stern first. Kyokusei Maru followed, her bow splitting open like a wound. From the surviving ships, sailors screamed orders, but no one could hear them. Engines failed, guns jammed, decks melted. The air smelled of burning oil and cordite, a scent that would never leave those who survived. Lieutenant Takashi Miyata, one of the few officers to escape, later wrote, "The air screamed. The sky and sea changed places. Every sound was a hammer." Admiral Kimura remained on Shirayuki's bridge until the flames forced him overboard. He surfaced among bodies and debris, his uniform torn, his leg bleeding. All around him, the sea burned. He called out for his officers. No one answered. Nearby, soldiers from the 51st Division struggled in the oil-thick water. Some clung to planks, others floated face down. The fire rolled toward them like a living thing. They tried to swim, but the heat was everywhere. From above, B-25s made another pass, strafing survivors in lifeboats. The orders were clear. No reinforcements could reach Leh. Lieutenant Miyata recalled, "We tried to pull men aboard, but bullets found them even there." The water itself was burning. By 10:30 in the morning, less than 20 minutes after the first shot was fired, the battle was over. The sea that had been calm at dawn was now unrecognizable, a floating graveyard of twisted metal and bodies. Of the 16 ships that entered the Bismarck Sea, 12 were sinking or ablaze. Thousands of men were dead, dying, or adrift. From above, Allied pilots could see everything, the burning convoy stretching across miles of ocean. Major Liner later wrote, "We didn't need to count ships. You could see them dying one by one." When the B-25s turned for home, a profound silence fell over the wreckage. There was no more gunfire, only the crackle of flame and the sound of the sea swallowing what was left. By nightfall, the last of the ships slipped beneath the surface. The water glowed an eerie orange from the fires still burning on the massive oil slick. When Japanese submarines arrived hours later, they found only bodies and debris. The reports they sent back to Rabaul were short and brutal. Convoy destroyed, survivors few. Of the 6,900 soldiers who had left Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 would ever see land again. The rest remained, entombed in the dark depths. Admiral Kimura, pulled from the water by a rescue destroyer, said nothing for hours. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper. The sea itself was our enemy. When the news reached Tokyo, the silence inside naval headquarters was heavier than grief. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto read the report twice, then set it down carefully on his desk. 8 transports, 4 destroyers, he said aloud. Thousands lost. He paused, the weight of the words filling the room. Then he added softly, "If this is true, we no longer control the sea." The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just a defeat. It was a revelation. Japan's rigid doctrine, its discipline and its strict hierarchy had met their absolute opposite. Raw, unpredictable improvisation. The Americans had rewritten the rules of naval warfare with tools, wrenches, and sheer courage. From that day forward, Japan's vital convoys would sail only at night. The empire that had once ruled the Pacific by daylight now moved like a fugitive in the dark. In the months that followed, Japanese sailors gave the modified B-25 a new name, Hachime no Oni, the 8-eyed demon. They swore its guns could see in all directions. Every convoy that sailed after March 1943 did so in fear of that demon. Every black horizon carried its echo, the mechanical scream of 8 machine guns shredding steel. For the Americans, it was proof that innovation was a weapon as deadly as any bomb. For the Japanese, It was the moment when courage and tradition collided with something they could neither predict nor stop. In time, the innovations born in those dusty Australian hangars spread across the world. The B-25 Strafer became the blueprint for the gunship, a concept reborn decades later in aircraft like the AC-47 Spooky and the AC-130 Spectre. Every modern aircraft that carries a forward gun, from the A-10 Warthog to the Apache helicopter, owes a quiet debt to Major Pappy Gunn and his men with their torches and welding rods. Yet those who survived the battle never called it a victory. They called it survival. The pilots of the 3rd Attack Group rarely spoke about what they'd seen. One of them said years later, "We didn't cheer when we landed. We just sat there. We'd seen too much." Today, the wrecks from the Battle of the Bismarck Sea lie under layers of coral and sand. Divers who found them decades later saw something remarkable: steel plates riddled with perfect round holes, each the size of a .50 caliber bullet. The pattern was precise, a frozen echo of that 15-minute storm of fire. Sunlight filters through the water now, touching the guns, the twisted railings, and the final resting places of men who once believed the ocean was eternal. Above, the waves roll quietly, as if trying to forget. But the sea remembers. It remembers the calm before the fire. It remembers the sound of invention and the terrible price of it. And beneath its surface, the legacy of those 15 minutes still sleeps. A monument to courage, ingenuity, and the awful transformative power of war.